All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I want to thank everyone tonight for coming tonight to the Environmental Education Forum that's entitled Ins and Outs of Sea Level Rise in Alabama. And this series is focused on environmental topics that are directly impacting people and plants and the environment across Alabama. And all of our forums are really helping us to learn about the important issues, and so that we can learn about what the issues are and also how our vote can make a difference. I wanted to really highlight the League's position on climate change. The League of Women Voters, all of the actions that we take are grounded in the positions that have been established by the League through study and through consensus building across all the members of the League across the United States. And so this statement that I'm going to read is the national position on climate change. The League believes that climate change is a serious threat facing our nation and our planet. The League believes that an interrelated approach to combating climate change, including through energy conservation, air pollution controls, building resilience, and promotion of renewable resources, is necessary to protect public health and defend the overall integrity of the global ecosystem. The League supports climate goals and policies that are consistent with the best available climate science, and that will ensure a stable climate system for future generations. Individuals, communities, and governments must continue to address this issue while considering the ramifications of their decision at all levels: local, state, regional, national, and global. And so tonight's panel will include presentations on the science of sea level rise, the impacts to people and the environment, and how to take action individually and as a community. The panelists will review recent changes in sea levels along coastal Alabama and anticipated changes to come. They will also discuss how this has already impacted changes in flood risk locally and subsequently reduced community resilience. Panelists will also go over different ways that individually they can support, individuals can support mitigating and adapting to sea level rise. And it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists tonight. Renee Collini is the director of the Community Resilience Center at the Water Institute. Rellinger is program director, a program for local adaptation to climate effects at Mississippi State University and Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant. Qiyamah Williams is community resilience specialist with a program for local adaptation to climate effects at Mississippi State University. And I'm going to hand this off to Renee. And so that Renee and Allie and Qiyamah, I appreciate your coming, and thank everybody else for attending.
Hey y'all, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and I tested it before, so now for sure it won't work, but let's try it. Can y'all see our slides? Yes. Okay, awesome. So my name is Renee Collini, and I'm just going to sort of briefly introduce myself a little bit more, and then we'll hand it off. So I'm the Community Resilience Center Director, and I've been working across the Northern Gulf of Mexico for over 10 years now, specifically on sea level rise and climate change resilience and tackling these issues in a variety of different contexts. And I used to have the pleasure of working in the same place as Allie and Qiyamah, but with that, I'll kick it over to Qiyamah next.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. I'm Qiyamah Williams. I'm a community resilience specialist with PLACE, which is our shorter acronym for a program for local adaptation and climate effects. And we are an extension program from Mississippi State University. We're based in Biloxi. And we also do work with Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, focusing on sea level rise and flooding and the impacts of climate change, to our coastal area for the Northern Gulf. So Mississippi, Alabama, and we even reach over to the Florida Panhandle. And I will pass it over to my director, Allie.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us. Like everyone said, I'm Rellinger, and I have the pleasure of being the director of PLACE and getting to talk about sea level rise and work with our community a whole bunch. Since I'm talking to all of y'all in Alabama, I will tell you that even though I'm at Mississippi State, I spent a lot of time living and working in Alabama before I came to this job. I had the pleasure of teaching environmental science at the Alabama School of Math and Science for many, many years, and working for the city of Mobile before Renee lured me over to Mississippi State to go work in there. Renee, you want to go to the next slide? Oh, you did to go to the next slide. So this giant acronym that we keep talking about is the extension program that Qiyamah and I work for. And we are really focused on coming up with ways that the community can increase their resilience to climate change and then all of those impacts. And so extension is really all about taking science and giving it to anyone who needs it and can use it. So we kind of have this framework that you see here in this lovely little arrow logo, where it starts with understanding risk. How can we help anybody in the community understand the risk that they might be facing because of climate change? Then we also help communicate that risk to a whole bunch of different stakeholders. So we work with everything from municipal staffers to school kids and everyone in between. And then the ultimate goal really there is then to facilitate some action based on all of this. So hopefully that's what we're doing with y'all today as you're learning and understanding and figuring out ways that you guys want to facilitate action on climate change. And I'm going to pass it over to Renee to talk about her program a little bit.
Thanks, Allie. So just a little bit more about the Community Resilience Center. I actually was at Place and left Place to start this center, and it does reach across the whole Gulf of Mexico, or the U.S. portion of the Gulf of Mexico. And it was kind of a nice way to flip the script of, working on climate change as like the lead in areas that sometimes are underserved or undercapacitated. But now it's the flip, right? Like we're really addressing systemic barriers around climate resilience in the Gulf Coast, and then also bringing more capacity and expertise to communities that might not otherwise have had access. That is a wide array of things. We touch or work actually pretty heavily on insurance affordability and availability. We look at equitable flood risk policies, pathways and legal and policy opportunities around community-led migration, and then also just like the fundamentals of equitable climate resilience. And then just as a side note, I did also used to be a member of the league in Mobile, and then also I was on the state of Alabama on the board for the league. So I'm glad to be back here and getting to meet with many of y'all again. So with that, though, we're going to stop talking about us and ask about y'all. Mainly, so our plan today is we want to set the ask. What do y'all want to learn about sea level rise today? So we're going to kind of talk about the hazards, what's getting worse and why, talk about different impacts and how some of them aren't the same for everyone, and then thinking about what can you do at work, at home, in your community. And so first, though, go ahead and put in the chat, what questions do you have about sea level rise? What brought you here today? What specifically do you want to learn about? Is there anything that you want to make sure that gets answered today? And so what we'll do is y'all put the questions in, we're going to answer them right now, but they should get answered as we go through. And if we don't, we want to have those at the end so we can make sure we touch on them and discuss them directly. So we'll take just a few minutes. I wish I had a Jeopardy music. So y'all can put in the chat questions that you have. I got my timer going.
Got a good one.
Yep,
On
starting to
Mobile
see some
Bay.
questions come in. Yeah.
Excellent. You know what else I didn't think about, Renee, in our intros that I am now, because I actually don't get to talk to women's groups specifically that often, but like climate resilience is a really women heavy field, and both of our teams are mostly female, heavily female, and so it's nice to focus on women.
And Lella, Allie and I have a fun game to answer your question. So if we have time at the end, maybe we can play it.
Cool.
All right, well, we're going to keep going, but as you have questions, please keep dropping them into the chat. Don't wait. We do have time to ask as we move through it, but don't wait for us, right? Like if as soon as you have a question, drop it in the chat, and then we will make sure that we answer it as we go through. Like I said at the end, we have plenty of time to chat about it. So with that, we're going to get into some of the fun stuff, and I believe, Allie, you are kicking us off talking about worsening hazards.
Yeah. So we want to start with, talking about what does sea level rise even look like? And I can already see from some of the questions you guys are putting in the chat, like this is a question that we're faced with a lot. Like if you want to go outside and look around and see how climate change is impacting you, what's that look like? So that's where we're going to start with really thinking about how those hazards that are around you are changing because of sea level rise. So this lovely gray circle right here, imagine this is a storm drain outflow pipe. So this is where all your rainwater and stuff from the street is flowing down and then out into places like Mobile Bay. All right, click it, Renee. So first things first, if you're imagining this pipe as a cross section being filled up with water, we're thinking about the base things that storm drains are supposed to do. This little drawing here shows you that under normal conditions, there's rain, it goes down those storm drains on your street, it goes through a complex series of pipes out somewhere into a nearby body of water. When they were designed and built, they would have been above the sea level. But as the seas have risen, they've started to block those storm drains. And in a lot of situations, that water's starting to come back up it. You can do the next one. Then we have other things that are happening. This is trash, debris, leaves, things like that that might be clogging your storm drains. And so that's also changing that capacity of the storm drains and causing things to worsen a little bit. Next one. Then, as y'all are probably no stranger to, we do have a lot of growth and development on the Gulf Coast. And as we are growing and developing, the way in which water moves and flows is changing. And that means because we're building more hard surfaces and things like that, there's more runoff going into the streets and less going into, the farmland or pasture that might have been there before. That's adding more burden to this poor storm drain. Then last but not least, we are also experiencing changes in our rainfall patterns. And so we know that we're having more extreme rainfall events. It's already really rainy throughout the whole Southeast, so we have a lot of rain, but it's coming in harder chunks. So we're not necessarily getting more of it, but we're getting really, really hard downpours of it and less of those moderate, lighter rain events, which means that it's overwhelming this system potentially. So when you add all of these things up and include sea level rise, then we're starting to see things like our storm drains being completely overburdened. So this is one of the ways that we are noticing impacts of sea level rise in our community. Next slide, please. So you can see from this little schematic, one of the other ways that our hazards are worsening. So we talked about that reduced storm drainage, and we also have increasing erosion. And so every single day on the coast, we have tide going up and down and up and down. And as this little graphic helps you see that little bit of increase starts to eat away and change the shape of our shoreline. Then as this happens every single day over time, then we can have things like large storm events. And when they do happen, first of all, their storm surge is going to be a bit exacerbated because of the sea level rise, but because of that increase in erosion and the changes to the shorelines in general, that storm surge is going to impact places far beyond what it's ever impacted before. So those two things go hand in hand. That increased erosion is already problematic on a daily basis, and then you get the storm surge on top of it. We also have problems with things like high tide flooding. So all these low-lying areas, or as erosion changes our shorelines, then we have lots more days of high tide flood events. So these aren't associated with the storm or anything in particular, especially on the Alabama coast this time of year when the wind will start blowing, pushing water up against the shoreline, and you have a high tide event and stuff. Now with the increased sea level rise we've experienced, those places are starting to overtop more frequently. And so we don't even have to have a tropical storm event to see these sorts of flood events starting to happen. Then one of the really big hidden impacts of sea level rise is something we call saltwater intrusion. So water doesn't just come over land at us. There's also our whole groundwater complex and our aquifers and things like that. And that salt water also intrudes into our ground and kind of comes up from below and can get into things like our drinking water wells. It can also just get in, infiltrate further into our coastal region, bringing salt into places we don't want it. We don't want to drink salt water. Salt water is extremely corrosive to things like metal. So the intrusion of the salt in kind of this more hidden way can also have a lot of problems. So we also have other climate hazards that are happening and changing that we do want to mention because sea level rise isn't our only climate hazard, and we're going to focus on that today. But we do have some other big climate changes that are occurring. One of those is loss of nighttime cooling. We have seen an almost doubling of our number of hot nights. So those sticky nights where it never actually cools off. We used to get about 45 of them. Now we get about 90 of them. So there's now 90 days, 95 days a year, actually, in coastal Alabama that stay above 70 in the whole 24-hour period. So on top of all this, we're having to deal with heat. We are also seeing changes and shifts in our seasons because of weather patterns are changing. And so that can really change our experience on a lot of things. Winds are blowing at different times, rain's coming at different times. And that is just really changing the way we interact with our environment. And then we already mentioned this extreme rainfall a bit when I was talking about the changes in that storm drainage. We already are the rainiest place, in the country, more or less. We get over 60 inches of rain a year, but the changes in how that rain comes really matters. And having more of those 2+ inches in a really short period of time is becoming our norm and is expected to increase. And then the thing that's really confusing about this is that also means we're experiencing more drought. Because the rain is coming harder and faster, it has less time to soak into the environment, and we can actually see more droughts because of it. So we need that 65 inches of rain to come at a moderate amount and replenish all of our systems. As it comes harder and faster, it runs off, it goes into the storm drains, causes all those problems, and we then end up still in a drought, despite the fact that it just torrentially, rained several days ago. And then we are also just having heat waves, and heat waves are affecting both our marine and terrestrial environment. So you probably heard about this summer, the record heat that we had in the Gulf of Mexico. That plays into sea level rise. It also plays into our experience of temperature on land. So all of these things are happening, and this is what climate, change is looking like to us on the Northern Gulf Coast. Next slide. I'm going to pass it to you, Renee, I think.
Yeah, I got it. Sorry, I was kind of repositioning. So what does this mean for people? There are those direct damages, right? So individuals and communities, you can see here, there's our homes, but also our roads get washed out, right? These are things we invest in collectively. So we see from the flooding that comes from the events that Ali was talking about. There's also service provision interruption. So when there's flooding, that means things first of all, roads are services. We can't use the roads, but also fire, police, ambulances, just lots of interruptions of the services we expect. And again, so this is a picture from the Alabama Gulf Coast. That is a road. That's not a lake. That's not, that is a road that we should be using. And kind of related to that is economic impacts. So this picture that we just saw, that guy was actually trying to drive to a store to spend money. And instead he didn't. So there's these economic impacts where we see economy, and all these different activities just kind of ground to a halt. There's also insurance increases, which are a really big deal. I know it feels like it can't get worse, but actually there's this new system of risk rating 2.0 that's trying to get it more accurately assessing flood risk and then reflecting that in the price of premiums. And so we are seeing that they are really going up pretty quickly. Allie has a whole training session on understanding your insurance sheet that you get, your declarations page. And like I said, I'm working on insurance affordability and availability, but this is a big piece of sea level rise. These are some zip codes, not from in the state necessarily, but just from nearby in the Gulf Coast, where you can see the average change in premiums, and it's not insignificant. So now I'm going to hand it over to Qiyamah, and she's going to talk a little bit more, like we set the stage, right? Like, these are the impacts that we're seeing, and this is how they're getting worse as these have already risen. But the question is, how much? And so Qiyamah is going to talk us through a little bit about that.
Thanks, Renee. And I saw some great questions in the chat, so hopefully this will help answer some of those. So we do know that there are two main causes of sea level rise. So as temperatures increase for us globally, we get a lot of melting land ice. So that melting land ice is contributing more water into our oceans, but then also the water expands when it gets warmer. So if you harken back to the old chemistry days, you remember that the molecules move faster and expand. So not only are we adding more water into our systems, that water is then taking up more space, and this, increases as the temperatures increase. Next slide. And so we have a couple of ways that we can measure sea level, right? So how do we know this is happening? And so one of the ways is tide stations. And so these are usually locally along the coastal, how we measure it off of land. And so there's one on Dauphin Island that we'll be talking about when we talk about how much sea level we've seen so far, but we have them all across the country along the coast. And it's basically just like having a giant ruler in the water, right? We can measure how the tides change and how the sea level changes over time. But we can also measure it out in the middle of the ocean using satellites. And so we can monitor it these two ways. Next slide. And so scientists are able to take those observations and also project out what sea level rise is going to look like in the future. So every 5 or so years, a couple of federal agencies come together to release sea level rise scenarios. And so what you're looking at is 5 different scenarios. These are all possible futures of what sea level rise can look like for us. And so you see here on the graph, we're starting in 2020, and it's projecting all the way out to the year 2100, which, yes, feels like very, very far away. And one thing to note also is you see how we start off with all those different colors a lot more closer together. So there's a lot of certainty about, that shorter range of what we're going to see for sea level rise. And then as time goes on and we're looking out farther into the future, it gets a little more uncertain, right? So there's a lot of greater spread there. And you can see they range from low, which is our lowest scenario. And when I say scenario, these are those possible different futures based on, the choices that we all decide to make. And I mean that like in the global sense, not just us in the room here. Go ahead to the next slide. And so this is information specifically pulled from the Dauphin Island tide gauge, because that is the closest one that has collected over 50 years of tide data. And so if you look at that black solid squiggly line, that is a record of the observed sea level rise we've seen from there. And so as you can see, it goes up and down, and there's some variations, and they're able to take that historic information and then extrapolate out what will sea level rise look like in the future for this specific location based on what's happened in the past. And that is that dotted black line. These extrapolations only go out to 2050, so within the next 30 years. And we can see how much sea level rise we've already experienced. It's about 6 inches here. And if you look towards the future for those scenarios, within these next 30 years, we're expecting to see at least another foot or a foot and a half of sea level rise. And sea level rise is a lot more pertinent for us here in the Gulf, because as you can see, our dotted line of what our locally specific projections are a lot higher than what the expected projections are for the region. And so that's because we're seeing a great amount of acceleration of sea level rise, right? So not only is it increasing, but we're seeing a trend that it's increasing in a shorter amount of time than it did in the past. And so Ali mentioned those changes in precipitation. This is what we're looking at towards the future. So we've seen that the rainfall has changed in the past, and it's going to continue in the future. And what we're looking at here are observed changes in the frequency and severity. And I want to call your attention specifically to the map on the left, where it's showing that total precipitation on the heaviest 1% of days, right? We keep talking about extreme rainfall when we're getting a lot of rain in a short amount of time. And for the whole Southeast region, we're expected to see a 37% increase in those total heaviest days. And so this is because as the climate is warming, our patterns are shifting. So it used to be, extreme rainfall events were more rare, right? We have our regular rains, and then every now and then we have these like big rainfall events. But that's actually starting to shift. So as the climate's getting warmer, we're moving to seeing more extreme rainfall days and less regular rainfall days. And remember, those extreme rainfall days are when we're seeing 2 or more inches in a very short amount of time. And one of the biggest problems with this is that when our infrastructure was designed, this wasn't the case, right? And so a lot of our systems are old and are not designed to be able to handle this much rain. Next slide, please. And then we talk about different futures, right? And so a lot of this is, fueled by how warm our climate is. And so what we're looking at here are 4 different warming scenarios. And you can see as the scenario is warmer, that spread and that change is a lot higher. And so we talk about this a lot in conjunction with sea level rise, because we're not seeing just sea level rise, right? We're seeing sea level rise and more rain. And when they combine to affect us, we call that compound flood risk. And so some areas, like especially in Alabama, we're going to have to deal with this problem from both sides, right? And the good news is that there are a lot of efforts that we are actually involved in as well, to figure out and identify where those areas are that are most vulnerable to things like compound flood risk. And honestly, there's just from having conversations with people in the community and also people's personal observations, it's like usually if you think about, how you've experienced personally the rain changing and streets flooding, you're able to really point out okay, things have changed. And this is an area where it maybe didn't used to flood, but now we're seeing it a lot. So that's why it's really important for us to talk with everyone in the community to see everyone's experiences with this flood risk. And this is our first pause for questions. And I see some more have popped up in the chat.
Yeah, I think there's a few in there that we can address. And first of all, y'all are asking some really great, good, deep questions about the science here. So I really appreciate that. One thing I saw in the comments is a comment that I've read about subsidence is significant on the Gulf Coast, including Alabama. So I did want to mention that. So those sea level rise projections and things that Qiyamah was showing you are what we call relative sea level. So that does take into account, we can look at global mean sea level out in the middle of, the ocean, not relative to any land, and measure that. But what else we can do is measure it from a fixed point at land. So those projections do include the fact that there could be some sinking that occurs. Louisiana is the poster child for the subsidence, but there is some subsidence in a lot of regions. And so Renee is navigating to the sea level websites that a lot of this comes from. And you can see here that they actually tell us for all these different scenarios. You'll see along the bottom, each of these bar graphs is labeled for those scenarios that we were looking at. And then they tell us what all is contributing to the sea level rise that we're experiencing in that area. And so that brown hunk at the top is the vertical land motion. So that's how we know how much sinking might be happening in a place. You can see that that's same throughout all the scenarios. We kind of know how much of that is happening. It's the other things that are changing, like how much is Antarctica melting. The higher scenarios driven by Antarctica and Greenland melting a lot more. There's some crazy things like land water storage that are in there. And then stereodynamic sea level is about how water moves in the ocean and the heating of the ocean and all of those like physical dynamics that play into it. So, Renee, do you have something you want to say? You came off mute for
I
a
was just
hot
going to
minute.
say, when Qiyamah was saying about how things heat up and they take up more space, like that's captured in that aerodynamic, along with like Ali said about the currents and how they'll change and move.
Yes. So how much your land is changing is going to, if your land is sinking more, that will make you experience more sea level. So there are places in Louisiana that are, having a lot of subsidence. Meanwhile, there's places in Alaska that are actually having rebound and it's outpacing sea level rise. So they're not actually experiencing the seas going up because the land is rising faster than the seas are. So that is taken into account in there. Yeah, this fun little graph shows you can see Louisiana as that very red arrow showing you that subsidence is a big problem. But you can see the rest of the Gulf and the East Coast of the United States, you have to get all the way up into like the main region before you start to see land sinking. So they are accounting for all of that in the actual science. Other questions I see in here are, why is the Gulf sea level rising faster? And that is a fantastic question. And actually, the three of us are working on a project with a bunch of researchers who are trying to figure that out right now. Renee, do you want to answer it? I just talked
Yeah,
about it yesterday, so you can talk about it today.
yeah. So there's a few different reasons why seas are rising faster in the Gulf than other places, right? So part of that is that um, those glaciers melt, and it's kind of wild to think about. But if you remember back again, high school science, that gravity, part of what dictates gravity is mass, right? And so those glaciers are so big and they have so much mass that, and when they melt, it actually kind of changes the gravitational field. And so as the water goes in, it also changes where it is. And so when things on the poles are melting, more water starts to pile up in the Gulf of Mexico. So part of that is just because, and it's wild, it's called, you can see the fingerprints of where the gravity changes and makes the water go as the glaciers melt. So part of it is because of where we're located, more of that water ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. Another reason we think has something to do with heat being injected into the Gulf. And they're not exactly sure where that heat is coming from, but they know it's there and it's causing, again, more heat means more movement, which means taking up more space. But we have 3 research projects right now being funded by the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Program to try and break down these different specifics. And so one team is actually taking a look at different fluxes of heat and wind and where all those things are interacting to change sea level, to try and track down maybe where that heat's coming from and what that's causing. Another team is actually trying to improve our ability to look at changes in sea level at a really fine scale, because right now we kind of have a larger scale, so they want to get a finer scale so they can identify things like different currents and their influences on sea level to see if that is also contributing some. And they have some preliminary results that suggest it might be. And then the last team is really digging in deeper on those glaciers that we were talking about and how they melt and where they go. So some of it we know why it's going faster in the Gulf. Some of it we don't exactly know why yet. What we do know is that it is moving up and it's moving up quickly, and we can see that with our own eyes and our own instruments. And so some of the details on why, we don't have all of it, but we have enough to know that it should be part of our planning in the next, for the things we're doing in the next few years. All right. So, well, I see your comment there about, is it more meaningful to talk about flood risk? I think people are it's much easier for them to see changes in their flood risk. I don't know, Qiyamah, if you want to maybe tackle that question from Lala there at the bottom.
Yeah, and so one of the ways that we talk about it when we do talk to community members is about flood risk, because that's something that's more relatable. And I think you had another comment about how people see sea level rise as a far away problem. And so being able to talk to people about how they're currently experiencing flood and how they're going to experience flood in the future is a really great way to connect with people and get them thinking about this issue without, getting too lost in the science, especially depending on who you talk to. Like, we don't always come into the community and start with talking about, oh, global warming and sea level rise, right? We talk about them as communities and as people, and everyone can relate to flood risk here on the Gulf pretty much. And so it's always a great way. And sometimes that's the way we approach this conversation with people.
And so it looks like we answered the question on, has it already begun to rise? Yep, it's been rising. Qiyamah highlighted those 6 inches that we've already seen in the past 20 years or so. And then I think we're going to answer some of these other ones as we move forward. So maybe we'll keep rolling. What do y'all think, Ali? Qiyamah, time to keep going? Okay.
I think we'll get to the other ones in a bit.
So one of the things that we like to talk about is that climate change and sea level rise and these impacts don't actually affect everybody all the same. And it's getting difficult in our country, which is a good thing, to talk about climate change, about talking about environmental justice or climate equity. And so we wanted to take some time with y'all to kind of table set and get some definitions down, and then talk about specifically with sea level rise, how you might see some of that. And so we just like to start with this graphic about how impacts are different for different people. And this is a study that came out in 2012, and I'm going to walk y'all through it. Each of these little graphs, this is people at risk to sea level rise on the y-axis, going up and down. And then across the bottom is measures of social vulnerability. So on the left over here is low social vulnerability, and on the right is high social vulnerability. And social vulnerability is just people who have less education, less money, things like that are high social vulnerability. And then people who have a lot of money and a lot of education and a lot of power and access, those are people that are over here on the low end of social vulnerability. And each graph represents a different part of the country. And so right off the bat, you can see the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of people at risk to sea level rise. But if you zoom in, you see these bars are different colors, and they represent different strategies that the research indicated that people would be likely to take. And so right off the bat, you can see people that are in these high social vulnerability columns have a lot more of that light blue of abandon. But if you go back and look at this whole graph, you see we have more light blue in the Gulf than anywhere else in the country. And the question is, why? And the short answer is a lot of things. But before we can talk about those things, we're going to give you all some definitions. So first is marginalization. What makes a community marginalized? These are folks that have been historically excluded from politics and decision-making, a topic that I know personally the League of Women Voters is very much aware of and has been involved in. Another term that gets used a lot is what makes a community underserved. These are folks that have either currently are or have historically received inadequate or disproportionately low levels of service and resources. And so we often see this in folks that are low income, non-white racial and ethnic groups, immigrant groups, rural communities that have limited economic investment. And so you can really see some trends here of these things lining up with marginalization and being underserved, starting to overlap. Another term that gets used a lot is overburdened. And so this is a federal definition of what makes a community overburdened, and these are minority, low income, tribal, indigenous populations that potentially experience disproportionate environmental harms or risks due to greater exposure and or vulnerability to environmental hazards. The last term I want to sort of talk about is equity. Equity is another term we use a lot. We talk about justice, we talk about equity. So equity is really, if things were equitable, it's about process, right? Procedures. And decision-making would be transparent and inclusive if things were all equitable. Same thing with distribution, right? Not just of risks, but resources and benefits, right? It would be equitably distributed. And then there's structural, right? If we did not have structural inequities, or if we did have structural equity, the existing systems of our institutions would not generate differences among different social groups. And so all those things in communities that are overburdened, communities that are that have inequities inside of them, communities that are marginalized or under-resourced, experience disproportionate impacts. And so this is redlining in the city of Mobile, Alabama. And you can see the red areas are the areas that were considered undesirable, and it really influenced housing. I'm pretty sure I don't have to explain this to y'all. If you do have questions about redlining, please put them in the chat. But basically this then forced minority populations to primarily live in these areas that are red. This is life expectancy in the city of Mobile today. The darker the red, the lower the life expectancy. So we can see those actions that happened in the early 1900s, 100 years later, are still impacting people's lives today. You also see, this is the floodplain for storm surge in the city of Mobile. And you can see that it's almost exactly overlapping with that redlined area. So we have higher social vulnerability and greater exposure in these areas. So when you have increased exposure, when you have less resources to adapt and recover, when the community is chronically disinvested in, so you're not seeing the improvements in the infrastructure. For example, in areas that have a lot of wealth, they can keep up with their infrastructure and adapt to these changing conditions. We don't see that in these areas. And what that leads to is those increasing costs being more prevalent in these areas. We see displacement and gentrification. So when there's a lot of damages or real estate goes slow, or if there's a change in something, we'll see people displaced and gentrified, particularly after hurricanes. There's also exacerbated health issues. We also see the community itself eroding and being sort of worn away. And then there's just overall economic deterioration. So when you have this increased exposure, the less resources, the chronic disinvestment, we start to see these disproportionate impacts sort of magnify through. And this example is from heat, but I did want to go ahead and highlight this for y'all as a way that it really just nicely ties together heat and health equity, where you see location matters, where you see economics matter, where you can see these compounding risks matter, and then social and racial factors matter. And so we start to see all these things come together, and it's the same thing with flooding. It's the same thing with a lot of the impacts around climate change. But we can change these outcomes. Sea level rise is not something that's going to sneak up and scare us. We know it's coming. It's already happening. We have time. And if we make decisions about our infrastructure, about our quality of life, about how we want our communities to look and what we want them to stand for, we have an opportunity to change these outcomes. Okay, are there any questions about environmental justice and climate justice and disproportionate impacts before we move on? And you can come off mute or you can put it in the chat.
Hello, Renee.
Yes, hi.
And Allie, hi. This is Reva Freilich. Sorry I joined late. Those last two slides, could you go over, just let me see them for 1 second. I was trying to take notes and I wasn't able to, yeah, that one. Yeah, I just wanted to, okay, community erosion, economic deterioration. Okay, economics, wait a minute. Let me see. Okay, and then the next slide, I'm sorry. Yeah, that one, it was.
And again, this one isn't specific to sea level rise,
right.
But you can see how location, economics, compounding risks, and then social and racial factors all come together and are things you have to consider if you're looking to pursue equitable climate resilience.
Okay, and I see this is being recorded, so thank you. Appreciate that. Really appreciate you having this seminar. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on this before we keep going?
Had a question in the chat.
Janine, is that a statement or a question?
It's a statement.
Okay.
In concurrence with what y'all are saying and about the heat slide that you showed 2 slides ago. That's another thing, is that the disadvantage, whether it's economic or all those other factors, they're they're disproportionately affected by heat waves, of which we're having more and more, and in unexpected places, not just on the Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
But as you said in the beginning, the number of nights where it doesn't cool down has doubled, basically, and it stays hot day and night for a ridiculous amount of time now.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see when we start to talk about some of the actions we take, a lot of the things that are good for flood resilience are actually good for heat resilience. So, there's a lot of overlap in what we can do. So I guess I gave myself a really good segue.
So, what causes it to be hotter in marginalized areas? I mean, it's the same sun and temperature is
So,
covers the whole city. So, what makes part of it hotter than other parts of the city?
so a big part of it, Donna, is these maps right here that you see. Redlining, was really critical in terms of distributing resources for residential housing, but also it dictated where other types of land use went. And so these redlined areas is also where you see concentration of, say, industrial activities, a lack of green space. There's also a lot of, so what you get is more concrete, which is much hotter. They're called heat islands. And then you also have less green space, not just for cooling, but also that means that there's more air pollution. It's just a much, even though it feels like it's the same city and you're just driving a few blocks over, it creates a very different physical environment.
Think like a divided street that has a green space for big old live oak trees and things versus, one that doesn't have any room, just has sidewalk and immediate, houses, and there's no room for like street trees and all these sorts of things that can have huge impacts on the heat in a specific area.
I feel like Allie and I've talked a lot. Qiyamah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a great way to cover it. I mean, it's like when it's a hot summer day and you're standing in the shade and then you step out of it and you're like, wow, all of a sudden it's 10 degrees hotter, but it's like that for entire communities.
I was thinking about when the blacktop is so hot, it's radiating up at you as you're walking across it.
Okay, thanks.
Does that help then?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I think, Qiyamah, the plan was you were going to walk through this slide and then we hand it over to Allie.
Sure. So
Or the other way.
yeah, either we'll go this way. But yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot of people like first questions were, how do we take action? What do those actions look like? And there are kind of two ways that we can think about resilience actions. The first is mitigation. So there's the larger, problem of the planet where the planet is warming, the rise is getting greater, we have a lot of carbon emissions. Those are global problems. And so mitigation is how do you address those larger problems? Click next. And then we can also think about it as adaptation. So this is where we're going to focus on in tonight. We've seen 6 inches of rise here already. We know we're going to see at least a foot and a foot and a half more. So what can we do to adapt to that rise we are expecting? How can we prepare as individuals, communities, as our whole municipalities? How can we prepare our lives in multiple ways so that we can deal with that flood risk and adapt to it? So we're going to dig in on that adaptation piece because that feels a lot more accessible, right? There's only so much that we can do about global carbon emissions, but we can take actions here in today and tomorrow. And so, am I talking about individual action?
I'll do it.
Okay, yeah, one of y'all.
Okay.
Someone should. I'll talk about it. Okay, you want to click the next slide? Okay, so we get asked this question a lot, and I'm glad that we do because, people want to really think about what they can do. And so we do really want to scale this to things because I think a lot of times, you have control over your individual actions. So this is something that a lot of these things seem a little too big. If we're talking about community actions and you have to, get your municipalities and things on board, so we want to think about the things that you have control over and then the things and that we're going to, influence and think about. So ways you can reduce your individual risk. Renee already gave you a preview. Flood insurance. We lead with this one because it doesn't always come up on people's radar as a big way to adapt and build resilience. But honestly, communities that have high amounts of people participating in flood insurance are able to recover more quickly when the bad things do happen. And if you know anything about flood insurance, it's a really interesting and fickle marketplace to deal with, but not everyone is required to have it. And so there's a lot of nuance to whether or not you need to have it, or whether you're required to have it. But tons and tons and tons of people, as this summer has shown us with these hurricanes, flood in places that aren't required to have flood insurance. So having flood insurance is one of the best ways you can protect yourself and help with this. Next. Retrofits to your home. Small things that you can potentially do that can make a really big impact on what happens if a flood event does happen. There is lots of guidance, like we have screenshots here from FEMA's Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting. And so there's a lot of programs and things. And then sometimes there's periodic grants and programs that help people actually pay for these things. So getting keyed into what you could do to your individual properties or a business to make it more resilient or something we can do. Next one. Look at future flood maps. So the slogan, knowledge is power, sort of thing. Understanding where your flood zones are, what your future flooding is going to look like so you can make those plans and adapt, help increase resilience so that you are just in the know. You can't plan for things that you don't know are going to happen. Next. Improvements to your yard. This one is all about storm drainage, and this is we kind of beat this one like a dead horse, but it's so important. There's so many things you can do in your yard that will help keep it from flooding. So we showed you how a clogged storm drain isn't gonna work, right? Trash, leaves, all sorts of other things. So making sure that you're not blowing your yard clippings into the local storm drain, that you're keeping, culverts and things clear. A lot of people have easements on their property and right of ways to access some of this type of infrastructure. And then you talk to folks that work from the city. I literally had a conversation with people in the engineering department at City of Mobile yesterday, talking about some of the wild things they had seen on properties trying to get out and do some storm drain mapping lately. So being aware of how important that infrastructure might be and doing improvements in your yard to, make sure that you're not doing something that might inadvertently end up having your house flood in a storm event. Like I remember it was a New Year's Eve and it was probably 8 years ago, and it ended up raining like 10 inches that night. And my husband and I were out there when we got home from a New Year's Eve party, raking leaves away because we'd just been lazy and not gone out there and raked the last leaves of the year. And they were damming up water, and it almost came in my sliding glass door because I didn't bother to clean my yard in a timely manner. So those kind of things. Next slide. We have wonderful resources available in our region if you want to figure out what you could possibly do, because there's more things than we could ever possibly go over in one evening. But this Coastal Homeowners Handbook was written by folks like the Sea Grant, Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant, Florida Sea Grant, Smart Home America, which is based out of Mobile, and Gulf of Mexico Alliance. And it was in printed form, so you might have seen it in printed form. It's now an app on your phone that you can download, and it gives you checklists and how-tos and understanding what you could possibly do. So it is an excellent resource. all of us on this call give it out to like anybody who owns a new home. We're like, congratulations, you just, moved here. Here's your copy of the homeowner's handbook so you can learn all about this. So this is a wonderful resource. If you haven't downloaded it, go to the App Store, download the Coastal Homeowners Handbook. There's a version for each state. So then it has like the state specific rules, laws, things that make it really, really tailored to where you live. Improvements to I love talking about improvements to the yard apparently. Reducing impervious surfaces is another big one. This one's a really cool little graphic. When you're thinking about doing some sort of backyard landscaping and things, paving over more of your yard is not going to help the problem. So there are alternative materials and things you can do, like this really cool permeable pavement that will help reduce impervious surfaces. And we've also been mentioning heat waves. So if you want your area to be cooler, not putting another slab of concrete to absorb and radiate heat will also impact like your heat mitigation too. So things that are good for flooding are often good for heat. You can do pretty things like rain gardens. The extension service and things will offer all kinds of workshops and stuff on how to put in these sorts of features. A rain garden lets you capture the rainwater on your property. So it's focused on don't let all your rainwater run into that storm drain that's already overburdened by sea level rise and the extreme rainfall. Get it to stay on your property and soak in a way that is beneficial for the environment and is not going to cause problems downstream of where you live. Next one. And there's fun things like rain barrels to capture rainwater on your own property too. So that way you're also reducing how much of it is running off in that storm drain system. And then you can use it, later to water your plants and things when it doesn't rain in those in-between times. So lots of really nice things to do. And then if you have shoreline property, we have a robust living shoreline program in Alabama where you can get all kinds of help from the Sea Grant on how to design and permit these things. There's a lot of economic studies on the cost effectiveness next to bulkheads. So, getting away from putting that wall on the water and using actual green infrastructure provides a lot of resilience. But I think the bottom line is plants grow back, but bulkheads do not. So, you plant these things that have the ability to withstand storms and grow back and can really help improve your flood resilience.
I'll just jump in real quick and say I did one of those economic studies comparing a bulkhead to a living shoreline, and you could see side by side where the same hurricane hit two properties, one with a bulkhead and one with a living shoreline, and the bulkhead got destroyed and it was very costly. And the plants were in the same spot, they just looked a little squished, and then they popped back up within a few days. Okay, here you go, Allie.
You can skip that one. I've talked about it already. I did want to point out that we do have local coastal cleanup programs and things, and they have been collecting all kinds of information on trash and debris that you find out there. And so this is just, I thought, an interesting graphic that tells you the type of stuff that is picked up when we do cleanup programs in our region. And so you can kind of see the things that are contributing to that trash and other debris that may be clogging your storm drains. There's lots of other pollution issues related to all this stuff, but you'll see plastic is just such a huge problem, and all kinds of straws and bottle caps and cigarette butts and all sorts of things. So these are really effective ways, especially working with young folks and things like litter reduction campaigns and things that will just help keep all of this garbage out of our systems. You can skip it. Somebody else want to talk about business readiness?
Yeah, do you want to do it, Qiyamah, or you want me
Yeah,
to?
I can do it. Yeah, so, we're talking about individual risk, but also, there's a lot of small businesses, right? This is the graphic for Mississippi, but there's 85% of small businesses in coastal Mississippi, and they employ a lot of people, right? So when we're thinking about storm readiness and preparedness and resilience to flood risk, it's not just for our homes, and we talked about a little bit, but how it affects our economy. So being able to make a plan for how you deal with flood risk or when there's a storm coming, right? Making sure that there's contingencies for employees, making sure that people, if there's a road that gets flooded from high tide flooding, how is that going to affect your business moving forward? And so a lot of it is just making plans, talking about that risk among your work, among employees, and talking about it to other businesses, right? How can you help each other to, survive and be resilient for the next hurricane? Allie actually has a really great story about this, but when she was the shelter director for the city of Mobile, she relied on other businesses and organizations for if the power would go out at the shelter, could she take, the medicine over and store it in other people's refrigerators, right? So how can small businesses connect with each other to build that network to then, continue to be resilient going forward?
And one thing I'll add to this too is we ask people like, oh, do you know if you're in a flood zone? And they might know for their house, but almost nobody knows if their office is in a flood zone. All right, so I think it's me for a little while to talk about resilience in a community. So we've talked about what you can do for your individual self and how you can maybe take that into your home or to your workplace. But as a community, there are some specific things you can ask of your city or your state to do. One of the big ones is codes and zoning. People, I think, sometimes think about codes and zoning as limiting what you can do or as being a problem, but really there's a lot of ways you can think about integrating resilience into the building codes. And so one around wind resilience people are really familiar with is like fortified building, right? You get discounts on your home or discounts on your whatever as a community, and it's it reduces your risk. Your house is more likely to stay there. But in the coastal areas of Alabama, that's actually our code, is to build to that requirement. And so same thing with zoning. If there are areas that we know are going to flood, why don't we just go ahead and make that a park or make it an area that when it does rain a whole lot, it can hold that water and keep the water out of our homes and businesses. And so that requires sort of really thoughtfulness ahead of time. Planning in general, I know sometimes people feel like, oh gosh, more planning, why are we having more planning meetings? Didn't the city just do a plan? But there are lots of different plans that have different purposes for the city. And good zoning, good codes, good actions, making sure you're taking larger scale actions at a community scale begin with planning, not just because then if you know where you are and you know where you want to go, you can get there better. But a big part of that is also being more competitive for funding. Having good plans helps you show people who have the money to spare, look, I know what I'm doing. Here's my plan. And then you're more likely to get those funds. There are a bunch of different types of planning. So like master planning and comprehensive planning is a way I think where a lot of people, almost every city has this, right? It's required in some states, the different municipalities have this. Comp plans have to be regularly updated, and this helps you understand, again, what do you want your community to look like? What are the things you're working on? And you can integrate flooding and flood risk and changing flood risk into these plans. There's also hazard response plans. We know there's going to be more hazards. Allie and Qiyamah just walked us through why there's going to be more hazards and what those hazards are going to look like. So we need to make sure we have, for the same idea, let's plan and try and avoid the hazards, but when they do happen, let's be ready for them. And also after they're over, let's rebuild more resiliently. Let's not build back the way we were that caused us damages, but let's build better. Another one is data collection. I think sometimes people don't necessarily want to see dollars go to monitoring. I did monitoring for a long time, so I'm a big fan of it in general, but these plans here that say like planning for how to go, identifying areas of risk, even those hazard response plans to build more resiliently, we can't do that if we don't have data to know where we are and what's going on. So a good example of this are vulnerability assessments, tracking our infrastructure system. So Pensacola just did a vulnerability assessment, but also the city of Mobile just wrapped a vulnerability assessment and a resilience plan. And one of the big things they were in the process of doing was actually mapping out all of their storm systems. And many cities in Alabama, but across the Gulf Coast, don't actually have those data available to them. So in terms of what you can do as part of your community planning, get involved, show up, ask questions, be heard, help move things forward. And this is for more than just major decisions. I think sometimes when there's a big event or a big, thing that's happening, a big change, people show up. But every single day, people are deciding where to spend time and money And so show up for those, because all of those decisions are being made by the people who are there. And those day-to-day decisions determine your day-to-day life. There's actually, going back to where the storm drains get cleaned out, right? Like we had this one story that was told about how this cul-de-sac was right next to a retention pond, but for some reason, every time it rained, the street flooded. And so finally they got on the horn with the city and were complaining and got somebody out there to clean it out. Well, apparently someone had taken the cover off the storm drain and all of the kids' basketballs were disappearing down the storm drain. And it was something ridiculous, like 16 basketballs. And once they cleaned the 16 basketballs out of the storm drain, it stopped flooding quite so often. But again, that's just a little thing. Who decided the city employees were going to go there that day, right? So from big to small, show up and participate. And that's how you can encourage climate change and sea level rise to be at the forefront, and that those day-to-day decisions are inclusive of these things. In terms of what you'd like to be asking your city to do, redefining infrastructure and investment, and what does that look like? How do we want to move forward? I think Qiyamah was the one who said it best about from the beginning about needing to have local perspectives and everybody in the community being able to contribute to problem solving and understanding these issues. And so asking your city officials and the staff, and same thing at the state level, to let the community lead the problem solving and the planning to address these changes that we're seeing and to address challenges in our communities. And then also asking for investment in capacity building, making sure that the constituency and the community, whether they're renters or homeowners or they're citizens or residents or whatever, they know about what's going on. They're able to chime in. They have the capacity to do those things. And also ask your city employees to be working on capacity building so that they can go after the federal grants to get this stuff in, that they're working on their ability to engage their community better. So these are all things you could be asking your community to do. And so with that, I think, Qiyamah, you're the one who'll end us on this note.
Yeah, I'll wrap it home. So, I mean, one of the biggest things that we can do and that we have been doing here tonight with all of y'all is talking about it, right? And so, part of our job is doing this and doing this work and connecting with researchers and communities to talk about it. And of course, when we mean it, right, what is this big it? It's climate change, it's resilience actions, it's equity, it's all the things we've been talking about tonight. And so the fact that you all are here and willing to engage and learn, we are hoping that you can then take this out and talk to all of the people in your life. And so what you're looking at now is from the Yale Climate Connections. They put out a lot of surveys to see how people are feeling, about climate change. And so I want to draw your attention to the two circles on the left, which are for alarmed and concerned. And so these are the people who have a really big belief in global warming, and are concerned and, hopefully would like to do something about it. But only 21% of those talk about climate change regularly, right? So there's a lot of people that are out there concerned and worried about what's going on, but aren't reaching out and talking to each other to talk about those solutions. So we're hoping that you all being part of here means that you're willing to help us change this. It honestly makes our jobs a lot easier when we're able to talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, my cousin, just had their house flood, and we've been talking about, how we've noticed that climate change is increasing, and we're able to help build these connections. And honestly, people tend to, have more trust and faith and are open about having these conversations with people they know, with their neighbors, with their family and friends. So it's one of the key things to wrap this all home is just to please continue to talk about it. Take what you've learned here today. Bring this up next time. I don't know, you're gonna have a coffee shop date with one of your friends. But like, did you know that we've seen 6 inches of sea level rise here? And how have they experienced that? So it is really important for us to change this silence around it and be more comfortable talking about it with each other. And so with that, we are going to check back in on our questions, see if there's anything we missed or if there's anything new that's popped up.
I see that Wesley has popped up. Hi,
Yeah.
Wesley.
Yes, Wesley has joined us. He also let the very barky dog outside with us. So,
All right, so let's look at some more suggestions or questions here. Emily is in Birmingham. Are there resources to alert to new flooding potential in the city? So Janine recommended the FEMA flood zones. Now I will say the FEMA flood zones don't update that frequently, and they also don't always capture stormwater flooding. So I would definitely, honestly, sometimes in bigger cities like in Birmingham, social media can help you start to pinpoint where some of those areas are. And you might look and see if your local weather forecast office has anything, or if the city has any alerts. That would be where I would start as well. And then, yeah, that's a great point, Riva. Do you want to talk a little bit about Riva's second point there, Ali, about the disclosure laws around if you get FEMA money to repair your house, how you have to keep divulging it?
Yeah. And so this is something that people don't necessarily, know, but when you go to buy flood insurance on like the declaration page, there's actually a spot that says like number of like actual flood loss, like claims against that property. And so this is something that is actually tracked and known. But if you're buying new property, this is the question you want to be asking realtors is like, what is the flood, risk, and has this property ever had flood claims? Because they do need to indeed share that with you if that information is out there. And so this is something that is gaining a lot of traction. Not every state has had requirements for this, or when the timing of the requirements. There's definitely situations where people go to close on homes only then to learn and have it disclosed at the closing table. That is personally not when I would like to find out the place that I am about to buy has previously flooded. So, thinking about those questions to ask, because that is something that is known and tracked, and is also something that you can look up on a property, like it shows up on your flood insurance page. And I've had some situations where people are like, oh, my house has never flooded before. Oh, show me your flood insurance declaration page. I'm like, there's a number in this column on this page, like your house has definitely had a claim against it before. And they might not have known. It might have been before there were disclosure laws, or in a state where you don't have disclosure laws. And so, but also we don't have disclosure laws on things like rental properties. I think New Jersey is the only state right now that I know.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know.
I know, so lots of people rent homes and businesses that have had flood claims against them, and there's not protections necessarily for people renting. So this is just an emerging conversation, and of course, since that's tied to policy and legislation, like those things do change a lot. So keeping tabs on, are there disclosure laws around climate damage that's happened to properties is something to keep tabs on, because it is ever changing, and there's a lot going on. But just knowing to ask those questions and empowering people when they're going and shopping and they're first time home buyers and things like that, and they just don't know, those are the kind of things that you can encourage people to really do.
Qiyamah, there's a good question here about do you ever come out and suggest that people simply avoid buying property in areas at greater risk of flooding from sea level rise, for those that are looking to buy property,
Yeah, and I think that ties into what Ali was talking about too, right? And so, a lot of the times, if people are coming in and buying homes in a new area and they're not informed, or they don't know the history of the area, so a lot of times it's up to the discretion of that realtor to tell them, if the previous owners to that realtor, if it is a very floody place. But it's important questions to ask. I mean, personally, in our jobs, there's only so much we can do about telling people what and what not to do. Instead, what we're really trying to focus on now is how can we work with realtors to let them know about these flood risks? Can we do trainings with these realtors? I want to say it's North Carolina that started a program to do these types of workshops with realtors to get them more informed so that when they're having people come out and visit these homes in these neighborhoods and these areas that have a lot of flood risk, that they can then talk and have those conversations with those potential homeowners. So it's looking at the avenues of like, how can we, hit this from multiple points? So not only are people more aware when they're trying to move in, because especially like sometimes people are trying to escape from a previous area where there was a lot of flood and maybe they're moving for those reasons. And so, how horrible is it if they then move to an area that also has flood issues, right? That are maybe like less pronounced, or they only see it when it rains. And if no one tells them that ahead of time, then they've invested into that area. So how can we kind of get to not only just the individuals, but the people who are helping people purchase their homes to then maybe mitigate some of those impacts and have those conversations again, right? Talk about it.
Thanks, Qiyamah. And then I'll take this question just so we're spreading the wealth around issues with municipalities regulating developers as they route stormwater away from their new homes. And so one thing I'll say is that most municipalities have pretty decent both laws and enforcement. Those are two different things. Laws and enforcement around needing to capture and move rainwater from new properties, usually into existing drainage systems. And so that part is usually okay. The challenge comes from the fact that we've been talking about the existing stormwater systems were designed to some level, and it usually is not the level that they're getting anymore. And so if those storm drains are overworked and a developer has appropriately met the laws and is, it's like they call it a 10 and 2. You have to capture at least a 10-year rain event on the property and release it at the rate of like a 2-year rain event, which is what most of the systems are designed for. But when the systems were designed to capture a 2-year rain event, that was at, a much less number of people adding to it. So the challenge when we see some of these changes in where rain goes or where it floods, it is sometimes people want to point and be like, they put that house there and now my house floods and it's their fault. And maybe sometimes that is exactly what happened. But sometimes it's just about these cumulative impacts actually not being part of those codes. And so when we were talking about codes and ordinances being able to help address climate change, it is about pushing the boundaries away from the norm and into considering looking ahead or cumulative impacts. These are all things to be asking for. So that was a really good question, Kathy.
Thank you. I had a follow-on to that, if you don't mind. I was really thinking about when we first built our house here in Huntsville, there was an old train tracks that's over 100 years old that was pre-existing, and it had a berm, and then there's a hill. And so they had all this water collecting on the backside of the train, and then they had this little bitty pipe that would carry all that rainwater. And the developer had literally gotten a little shovel and dug it around the backside of their lots. And of course, flows down, rainwater goes downhill eventually. And so it was really flooding a lot across our lot. And I guess the thing that really struck me was when you started trying to figure out how to fix it, it was like the train tracks were not city property. And so when you start trying to fix a problem, they're like, well, that's not our problem. That doesn't belong to us, even though it's in the city limits. And I just kind of wonder how, that may be common in other places is, different pieces of the infrastructure don't quote belong to the city. And so then you can't fix a problem because nobody is willing to take responsibility.
Oh yeah, that's a big part of resilience that amplifies the complexity, is whether it's a problem like that or about proactively getting ahead. Jurisdictions are messy, and jurisdictions inside of jurisdictions, if you're talking about cities inside of counties, but also like the sewer and water boards often are a separate entity from the city government, right? Or like it serves the whole county and it happens to go through the city, and oh wait, but all of our power and all of our internet are by private corporations. And so it does start to get real complicated real quickly, and we're not going to sit here and tell you that this stuff doesn't require a certain amount of perseverance through well, that's not my thing, that's my thing. One thing that does help me a lot to remember, and I'm going to say this since Allie was a city employee, I don't know if she wants to say it, but most city employees are good people doing their very best. at overworked, underpaid jobs with 3 extra jobs they didn't agree to when they took the job. And so it's not that people are intentionally trying to obfuscate or keep climate change as a problem or not to adapt. It's just that they are people that are working in a system and they are doing their best, but sometimes the system itself is the problem. And so just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to tackle these things. I think, Allie, you'd come off mute to maybe add to the developer comment.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. But you made me think of another one too. I mean, I will tell you that a lot of the resilience opportunities that are coming up right now are really prioritizing collaborations and working across things, and they're requiring people to like have cross jurisdictional things, and then like jobs like Renee and Qiyamah and I all have do also help bring those folks together. So having good mix of people working in resilience where we aren't bound by jurisdictional lines, so that we can help bring different jurisdictions together. So there's a lot of strategies for that. But I also did want to mention, because it also kind of brought in some stuff going on in the chat, we are starting to slowly see our data being more forward looking. So the conversation in the chat about like the FEMA flood zones are based on history. And that is a frustrating thing because they are not taking the forward looking, like there's no amplifier on like what's happening with sea level rise as they, determine those. So it just depends. Is your municipality updating them fast enough? But we do have things coming out. Like right now, Atlas 15 is about to roll out, and that is our precipitation frequency standards coming out of NOAA, and that is forward looking. So that's the document that tells you like what is the 100-year rain event. It tells you like how much, like how often we should get 2 inches of rain event, a 10-inch rain event, like that kind of information. But that it's currently a static number. It's just like, here's the number for these rain events. So if you're designing something, then those are the numbers you take and do it. But we're coming out with the new one, and it has that, but it also has this forward-looking piece to look at the projected changes we're expected to see. So it is slow, and that data is coming, but it is promising that people are realizing we just can't have that static historical facing data, and we are getting it. And it's going to take a while because it also takes a lot of data to make forward-looking climate projected information that we want to use to do that planning. So it's a process, but I am encouraged that the data is coming and out there. And I have a sweet little dude here.
Yeah. Well, all right. I appreciate all three of you, the conversation tonight has, I think it's been very enlightening, and it's also helping us starting to gain a better understanding. I know you've got some people online that have been working with you along the way, but a lot of the league members, we care passionately about the environment and climate change, but we are still we're learning what we need to know. And I wanted to thank you for sharing tonight. And I wanted to talk to the people that are in the audience. The league is actually planning our next step is going to be to do a climate change summit in Baldwin County on the 25th of January. And this is going to be an opportunity for our league members to gain in, to basically work with leagues across the Gulf Coast to come together to talk about our common issues, because one of the things we know is that we've got a lot of local leagues along the Gulf Coast, but we're not all talking. And so we need to be talking, we need to be sharing, and basically then figuring out how we can support the environmental groups that are already on the ground in those communities, but also, figuring out how we can be more strategic and also more effective in our advocacy. And so that's something that'll be coming up. We'll have more details, soon. I anticipate this won't be the only time we do this, because what we want to do is to build a relationship so that all of our league members who live along the Gulf Coast, we want them to start knowing each other just as well as the people within the state of Alabama, because we're all neighbors and we're all dealing with this